You are listening to the Wealth Formula Podcast with Buck Joffrey. Get ready to change your life.
Welcome, everybody. This is Buck Joffrey with the Wealth Formula Podcast. This episode is actually part two from the previous episode that features Dr. Ian Kurth, Dr. Paresh Mehta, and of course, Dr. John Foley, three very, very smart physicians that also, they're following the literature. They're being objective as they can. They are not letting, sound bites from the media cover, influence what they're saying. We're gonna talk this episode. We're gonna get into more of the vaccination issues, timelines, what the new world post-COVID might look like, and ultimately, the economic impacts that we as investors are starting to think about. So when we come back, we get the doctors back for some more good stuff. You're not going to want to miss it. I'd like to shift gears a little bit. And now that we're, we've kind of gotten to the point, we're talking about the curve, where we are with that. While we wait for the flattening of the curve, obviously we're trying to get these treatments. We're trying to, put some bandages on this thing. But ultimately what we are really waiting for is the development, of a vaccine of some kind. I'm wondering if one of you could explain the process of what goes into creating the vaccine and why does it take as long as it does, especially given the fact that, it's not like we're in 1919 and we're dealing with the Spanish flu, right? We've got a lot of these tools that John talked about. We've got artificial intelligence to determine probably the more difficult, the parts of the virus that are probably at best to target with an antibody, those kinds of things. Why does it take, this, 12 to 18 months, as everybody's been saying, and I just hope they're not saying 12 to 18 months from now, but why does it take that long? And do you really think it's going to take that long, or is that just to make sure that nobody's getting too excited?
Well, I can't speak to the actual specifics of it, but I can give some context, which has helped me. So I've kind of looked back at various pandemics and various initiatives. The fastest vaccine that we've developed, as far as I know, is 4 years start to finish. That happened in the 50s, right? And now we certainly have better tools, as you mentioned, to accelerate that. But there are certain just fundamental limitations that need to be acknowledged for a vaccine, before a vaccine is introduced to the public, deployed on a large scale, potentially, hundreds of millions, if not billions of people would be eligible for this. And you certainly want to have the everything as best as you can prior to that deployment. Again, I can't speak to the specifics, but I will also comment that, there's a reason why certain viruses don't have vaccines, right? We've tried for a long time to get an HIV vaccine,
sure.
and
Sure.
It's just proven confounding. We've had coronaviruses, as John mentioned, like 4 of them have been common colds. They've been circulating for years and years and years. We still don't have a vaccine against that. 2 of those coronaviruses, the SARS and MERS, have been, proven lethal. We've developed initiatives to get that rolling, but we still don't have a coronavirus vaccine. So within that context, to me, 12 to 18 months sounds fairly ambitious. And even if you could accomplish the science behind getting it to an eligible level, there are other challenges beyond that, which include, production challenges. Like right now, as I understand it, our vaccine production capabilities within our own factories are fairly muted if you take it and try to scale it to a population of 300 million. I mean, we're like the production capacity is whatever, call it 5 to 10 million doses per year for certain vaccines. And you're going to ask our country, with appropriate, advance notice, but we're going to ask them to sort of figure out a way to scale that impressively. So I would just sort of add those sort of a framework to this discussion.
And that's a good point, and actually makes it even sort of more scary. I mean, maybe Paresh, you can comment on this, but that's a good point. I mean, who's to say that we can get a coronavirus, a COVID-19 type vaccination or not? I mean, like Ian said, coronaviruses are usually associated with the common cold, and we haven't figured out a vaccination for the common cold. Is there a chance, a good chance, that we may not develop a vaccine at all in the next year or two or three?
Yeah, I think a couple things. I think Ian summarized it pretty nicely. But if you really look at the vaccine tracking data, I think there's about 4 vaccines and that they're currently looking at for COVID-19. Most of that is in the phase 1 or the safety timeframe to see if these would be safe to use in humans. They're able to kind of push that forward a little bit faster than normal, as they normally take years to get through that first phase 1 part. Because of some of the data they had for both SARS and MERS, where it initially started the work, and as it died down, I think some of the pharmaceutical companies and governments sort of lost interest. It takes time, both because of the fact that these viruses mutate, and also for some of the facts that it just takes time to get through these safety testing protocols to actually see if you can actually get something that is safe to use, let alone whether it works. So I think I agree with Ian that 18 to 24 months is ambitious. On top of that, once you actually develop the vaccine, in order to get it out to a population basis, that itself takes another 6 to 12 months sometimes just to produce the vaccine.
John, I'm curious on your take on this, and maybe, for people who are listening, if you have any more insight into the, first of all, if we couldn't do it for HIV, is there a possibility that we won't be able to do it for this? And if that's not the case, then why? And then maybe kind of tell us what you know from, obviously I think you've been following the literature on this, and give us some sense of where we are with vaccines.
Yeah, I agree with pretty much everything that's been said so far. Typically the first stage is to look for epitopes, which are places in the virus that an antibody could potentially bind, usually in the capsid, or in this case in the spike protein. This thing is very spiky. It has a kind of a receptor sites and
crown
to
a crown, right?
Yeah.
Corona crown.
Yeah, right. A corona, exactly. Yeah. So that's usually a couple of years. And then I think, as Ian mentioned, there's phase 1, 2, and 3 studies. And there has never been a vaccine developed to a coronavirus. Now, that's not to say it's not possible. I think that 12 months to have a vaccine up and ready to administer is highly unlikely. I think that some of the work, as I said early in the program, there's an 80% homology or similarity of the nucleotides from SARS to COVID-2. So some of the SARS vaccine work has definitely informed and helped the vaccine makers, but I do not think that there is 100% probability we will have a vaccine at all. I think it's probable, but not definite. And the time frame is likely more at a minimum with a crash program, and everyone's doing these crash programs, probably still looking at more like 18 months than 12 months.
Yeah. Well, do you think, John, what do you think though? I mean, I go back to the comment that, we don't have vaccination for the common cold, but maybe we never really needed one. So we never really tried, and then the HIV, I mean, because it's a retrovirus, is it just something that's probably inherently more challenging, and that's why we never got a vaccine for that?
Yeah, no, those are all good points. And there are also companies working on just developing antibodies that could potentially be given sort of as a drug. Yeah. And maybe not using the indirect route of having your own body produce the antibodies. So I I think there's a good probability we'll end up with a vaccine. I really do.
Yeah.
But time frame wise, not going to be soon.
Yeah. Okay. So while we're waiting for this, we've got, obviously we've got the country, we're dealing with, we're dealing with some issues. We're sitting at home. We're trying to flatten the curve. Here's a question that, it's controversial, particularly in, I think, our medical space, but my understanding is when we flatten the curve, we aren't actually decreasing the number of cases overall that we expect. We're just stretching it out. And so obviously the point of the quarantining is sort of we don't overrun the hospital system. And, like right now, we have shortages of protection for medical workers and stuff. But at some point when we start coming down on that curve, how quickly do you think we can and should, get back to work, start opening things up, at least for those businesses that, that people kind of need to do? I mean, do you have any feeling on that? I mean, there is a little bit of a balancing act here, right? I mean, obviously we can't stay forever. And if we know ultimately that overall probably the same number of people are going to get infected, then how does that shape your outlook on what we should do, Ian?
I would say that, first of all, an arbitrary return to the old economy, that's nonsense. Okay. So
right.
That's not rational and it practically doesn't exist. So there's, the path to, the new normal, if you will, I think, is a discussion. There's two extremes, right? You have, take your chance, the Swedish approach. Hey, we're going to go out there and just let everybody get herd immunity and see what happens. That also is demonstrably probably not a good idea for our country. And then there's the more draconian approach, right? Where you just it's the hammer, where you just put everything, draconian measures, China-like, everybody's in their house, where the virus is going nowhere. And somewhere in the middle, there's a dialogue and there's a process to allowing our economy to be functional, allowing people to resume a more normal existence. And to me, that revolves around data, really. I mean, it revolves around appropriate testing, contact tracing, epidemiology. There's a really, really good article, sort of lay article, about the hammer and the dance. And so, keeping, doing this social isolation and really clamping down to get the transmission down so that we can begin to release and do this dance where we're going to be under surveillance. We're going to kind of figure out a way practically to find people who are at risk or there's an exposure and isolate them so that we can kind of continue to keep the number of cases at a reasonable level, whatever that is, but at least to a level where we're not going to get overrun in our medical facilities. There is really a challenge for people to kind of come together and discuss how practically we can do this. But the other thing I would comment though is that, we really do need to realize that we're dealing with a novel virus. Nobody knows how they're individually going to respond. And so when you, with cavalier intent, say, I'm just going to go out there, just be cautious about that. We don't know the long-term effects, and as it's been mentioned already in this conversation, that mutations are possible. So we know, like, things can change. It can get more severe. It might get less severe. We don't know. But the fact is, we just need to continue to do what we know works well in some sort of moderation, to buy ourselves time to allow the other efforts that we've discussed to take root.
John?
Well, I think there's a couple things. One is we have to start loosening, otherwise our economy is going to just self-destruct. But it does have to be done in a logical sequence. I think you don't want, as has been mentioned, your surge capacity to be exceeded, like happened in New York. Then you have a mess. Your hospitals are overwhelmed. On the other hand, there is a second reason too to kind of slow things down a bit, and that's to really for the medical community to get their therapeutics act in order. There's also a little bit of data when you look at population data of Sweden, which has been very interesting because, of course, they've relaxed the least, or they've locked down the least, basically. They do have a mortality per 100,000 that's greater than the other Nordic states. They're about 19 compared to Norway and Denmark at 7 and 4. But they're still way less than the UK, for instance, at 27, and Italy and Spain at 41 and 46. So, I think that story about how much of a assistance this whole locking down process gives you is not entirely clear. Obviously, it bends the curve to some degree. The other thing is the Costa Rica data. Maybe if we hit on a regimen that really works early, we knock down the number of people going into hospitals and intensive care, and that completely alters the makeup of this thing. A case fatality rate under 1%, if they maintain that, that's kind of the way forward potentially with early hydroxychloroquine, maybe with zinc or azithromycin. So I think there are some positives here. I'm a little bit skeptical about test, trace following, and isolation of at-risk populations. There's just such a large group of people that are asymptomatic in relationship to the people that are clearly diagnosed, and the early ability to transmit virus before you're symptomatic, that it's going to be hard in those areas. Yeah. I think we have to try it. Certainly the at-risk populations, the older diabetics and maybe elderly people in general are going to need to be quarantined longer.
Presh, what do you think it's going to look like when we come out of hibernation?
Buck, I think it's going to be sort of the new normal, which is going to be quite different than what we saw in January or February, both socially and clearly from a business and investment standpoint. Socially speaking, I think, none of us imagine a month from now, Friday night, heading out to a Chili's with a group of friends and hanging out as a group. I think you're going to see a big change in the way that we do with a lot of our social interactions and, just some of the fear that naturally comes with this as an individual, and especially with a virus that you're not sure who's had it, who doesn't have it, and what is really my risk of getting into a severe situation. But like everything, we're right in the midst of this. And as we continue to move forward with both the testing and some of the things that we talked about, likely a combination of everything John and Ian and yourself have mentioned, I think over time we'll get better grasp on how this is going to shake out, but it's definitely going to be different.
Let's talk money now, because obviously that's what we usually talk about. Let's start with you, Ian. What kinds of things are you invested in right now, and how have those investments been affected by the economy?
So primarily I have a lot of my portfolio invested in various niches of real estate. So multifamily, self-storage, mobile homes, VRBOs, single-family homes. The majority of it is in a relatively illiquid state that is, in my opinion, reasonably recession resistant just by its very nature. And that has proven out historically. But again, part of this whole process is that I'm forcing myself to challenge my previous assumptions because the new normal requires that. But, beyond that, I also, right now, frankly, I'm sitting on a lot of cash. And I have part of that was being built up over time, but I use that as sort of an insurance against life. Not life insurance, but insurance against life, because you just don't know. And this whole process, not that I've predicted this in any way, but I have enough experience and have enough humility to know that it can happen. Something can happen, and it just gives me the peace of mind to sleep well at night, to have that sort of allocation. I'm probably a little more weighted that way right now, just for the way the economy has. And because of that, I'm in a position of anticipation that opportunities are going to present themselves as all this shakes out, but certainly not in the near term.
So, John, what, if anything, is, maybe you talk about what you're invested in, but what have you learned during this period of time in terms of your investing and money management strategies? And would you do anything, or will you do something differently as a result of this time in history?
Yeah, I think I mean, this is fed into my somewhat paranoid nature to begin with, and I think that some diversification. I hate that word diversification, but
yeah,
I mean, in this situation, I'm glad that I sort of hung on to my small percentage of precious metals that have performed extremely well. I think that you can't get too focused on just one asset class. Like Ian, I'm mostly invested in real estate, but I'm more liquid too in cash right now. And this just goes to show you, and Nassim Taleb, he's probably got something going with that whole black swan, anti-fragile thing.
Right. Right. Absolutely. How about you, Paresh? Lessons from this that you're going to carry forward?
Yeah, I'll start from the beginning. Definitely alternative assets. I'm in real estate. I'm doing some diversification with tax mitigation and also a few hard money lending type of situations, both a fund and some smaller deals. I'm also sitting on a lot of cash. I'm waiting for some opportunity that looks like it's going to arise as we cross through Q4 and definitely into 2021. And I'm spending my time just working relationships, trying to use that mantra to be sure when the opportunity arises, how can I deploy that cash to get the most successful outcome?
So I'll just throw in my 2 cents in this. And first of all, I think that here's a few things that I've kind of learned. One is that I think, having some kind of source of liquidity is really important, right? As real estate investors, and I am totally guilty of this most of the time, we don't usually have any liquidity sitting around. Like, we usually have whatever we get, and then we maybe have a couple months of liquidity just in case. But then then we just make sure that we deploy it right away. In the given situation that I got kind of lucky because I had money in the wealth formula banking. And in addition to that, I was actually hoarding cash as well. Actually, because I was planning to buy a house here, and in Santa Barbara, and you need a lot of cash for that. So I got lucky in that regard. Otherwise, I'd hate to be worrying about paying bills and stuff like that right now. So that's one thing. I do think, situations like this, are good evidence for, permanent life insurance stuff like wealth formula banking, because then, those policies are still growing, right? They're still growing. They're still cash and liquid. The other thing is, I think that I'm trying to look at this situation that we're in a weird way. I remember as a medical student, I don't remember what somebody knew they were dying. They were totally conscious and they were totally aware of it. And they were kind of a little bit, what's going on? And they were kind of freaking. You could see the fear on their face. Right. And I kind of feel like that's where we are in the economy right now. It's a really peculiar situation. And I think those of us who are probably paying more attention, I've used this analogy before, but we just got hit. We just got rocked with an 8 Richter scale earthquake, and we're sitting and not even noticing this massive tsunami that's coming. The massive tsunami is because we're going to have it. Just don't know how we're not going to have 20% unemployment come Q4, come Q1, and when some of the safety nets are taken off. It's incomprehensible to me what that looks like right now. So based on that, what I'm feeling a little bit lucky because I feel like the things that that I am mostly invested in are related to things that people absolutely have to have. They have to live somewhere. Specifically, they're people in working class that have to live somewhere. So I feel pretty comfortable with that. So for me, sticking to those basics just reemphasize that. And also the idea to make sure that there is some sort of liquidity, whether that's straight up cash, whether that is, a cash value in life insurance policies, et cetera. How about you? Who hasn't given their take? Was it Ian?
I was just going to say, part of this process, it's motivated me to kind of get a historical perspective on things. So I've done, I've grabbed some biographies that I've been sitting on my shelf and I've been reading them. And one of the I kind of like Churchill. He's an interesting character and certainly has lived an amazing life and had his share of adversity. But he had a quote that says, "This is not the end. This is not even the beginning of the end. Rather, this is the end of the beginning." I mean, this is basically like us sort of like moving into a new realm for this sort of generation that is uncharted for the most part. And challenging old assumptions is critical. Asking yourself quality questions, really exploring the blind spots that you might have is a prudent exercise.
Well, listen, guys, thanks for all your time today. And it's been a really good talk. And, I appreciate all of your inputs, not only from the medical side, but also on the investing, because, all three of you are, active members of the investor club, and you're doing things at a very high level. So it's nice to get your perspectives on things as well. Any last kind of words that you'd like to say to the Wealth Formula community before we get off?
I'll start. I'll just say that, don't panic. I know that when we all get into these type of situations, it's very tricky when it comes to assets and trying to get more cash flow. And I would say, somebody once told me everybody's a genius when the market is going up. It's really being the contrarian when things are going down to figure things out. Mentally framing this in a way that this is going to be an opportunity for the Wealth Formula Group is the right way to think about it.
That's right.
Use the education that we've gotten from Buck and many others, the skills that you spend time learning in order to effectively use this time frame to come out better than when you started. The only thing I would tell people is, keep ongoing communication with all of the operators and other people that you work with. Be sure you're the first person they're thinking about when things turn or if a deal lands on their desk, and just stay educated. That's really what's going to
nice, very, very thoughtful response there, Paresh. Thank you. One thing I would also advocate is so zoom out, right? When this is going on, sort of get yourself to a point of being able to detach from the emotions that are involved. And so, there's a colloquialism where you think locally, but I think globally, but act locally. So like you're aware of what's going on, but your sphere of influence is actually what you can control and what you can impact. And, so I also sort of take the approach that I try to control what I can control, and everything else is external to my sphere of influence is I let that go because it tends to be a stressor. It's reality, and I deal with it in that frame. But I try to influence where I can and let go of those other things. And the other thing that I would also say is that, it sounds weird, and I don't want this to come off the wrong way, but I would try to also frame this time and this experience as an opportunity. I mean, many people have been gifted time. They've been gifted the opportunity to sort of, pursue hobbies that they might not have because they're, not doing all of the crazy things, chasing kids, going to the office, all of that thing. They have the opportunity to take that time and read things, learn things, start a business, time to be closer to their nuclear family, time to sleep, time to, focus on your diet, all kinds of things that you can choose to take control of in this time of uncertainty. And basically it's sort of, it's like forced load management. And It's an experience that really is unique. I mean, I can't think of another time where you might have this if you're lucky enough to sort of be in that. And I realize that I'm speaking from one perspective and there are other people that don't have that that luxury. But if you can frame it in a way that you can find the opportunity that this presents and capture it.
John?
I think you want to you want to always have a plan B, maintain enough flexibility to pivot to an alternate reality, and to try and work on what Taleb would call anti-fragility, anti-fragile. That you can roll with the punches and still go on.
Good advice, guys. Thanks again for being on the podcast this week, and I hope you stay healthy and try to have some fun during the quarantine.
Thanks, Buck.
Thank you for the opportunity, Buck. Thanks.
We'll be right back. Welcome back to the show. That is it for our week of, 4 doctors, a virus, and an economic disaster, right? I mean, that's basically what this series of 2 mini-series or whatever you want to call it of shows is all about. And hopefully it's given you a little bit better perspective. I think that, just to emphasize my view on the economy, I can't say enough. A number of times I've said this already, but I still think the best metaphor to think about in this situation is the earthquake and the tsunami, right? Really what we've got right now is a situation where we have been hit unexpectedly by a 9 Richter scale earthquake, and there's debris falling out. There's still aftershocks, etc. But the real damage of this thing you're not going to see until that tsunami prevails, and that tsunami is going to take a little bit of time. It's building up energy, and it's rolling towards the shores, and it may be the end of it may be Q4, it may be Q1, it'll roll into 2021. And that's when we're going to start seeing, a lot more defaults. And that's when we're going to start seeing potentially some of the best buying opportunities of your lifetime. Make no mistake, I truly believe that the economic, the economic outcome here is worse than 2008. I just think that there's such a severe issue with unemployment, consumer spending that is not going to go away very soon. So you can look at that and you can be scared, or you can start thinking, well, good, we will have an opportunity to buy and hopefully by mid-decade really, really make some nice profits. So there's a positive side to this too that I think it's important to think about. But in the meantime, obviously it's about, preservation, keeping your eyes open for opportunities. If you are in a situation where you would like to deploy some capital right now, I mean, I have an investor club. We have been talking about some opportunities in the oil and gas space. And the reason we've been doing that is because that space in particular, it's really hard to imagine it actually getting worse. Because if you think about it, right now, energy consumption is probably as low as it will probably ever be until the next time we're quarantined, until the next time we're quarantined and the world goes into a shutdown. So other than that, I mean, I think it's a wait and see game. Anyway, that is it for me this week on Wealth Formula Podcast. This is Buck Joffrey signing off.
Thank you for listening to the Wealth Formula Podcast. Visit us on the web at wealthformula.com. The information contained in this podcast are opinions, not fact. As always, consult your own financial team before making any investment. See you next time.